publish the book today, like later on today, and about the possibility of a high school edition, which would be kind of interesting for as a curriculum. It's already being used for curriculum in college, I think high schools and maybe grade schools too. But and I also have a big blog site online that has lots of articles and things. So that's actually the start of this book, that big blog site where I had lots of articles focused around the native peoples of Oregon and especially the Willamette Valley. And so I actually used a lot of those essays as kind of the blueprint and perhaps the first draft of some of the chapters in the book, which is my own process. So anyway, I want to take that further. I want to do more on the valley. I've done lots of research the last couple of years in this area, working for Lane County Museum, working for City of Eugene, City of Springfield, McKenzie River Discovery Center, places like that, trying to sort of figure out like what happened here, because we don't have there's not a lot of detail and facts that appear in a lot of histories right now, and so like where are those people? What happened to those people? So I'm figuring that stuff out now, and so hopefully that'll be turned into another project in the future, or it is a project, but another sort of book in the future. Okay, so let me just move into this. I figure about less than an hour. I'll be like 45 minutes on this, and then we'll do questions. I'll sell a few books. They're $25 a piece, and I have various forms of way you can pay me. But for now, waiting for my slide advancer to get there. Okay, you don't need to see me, just slides. It's okay. I'm extra. That's fine. All right, there you go. As best we can. So maybe if you lower the blinds a little bit more, that might be better. I don't know if somebody can do that. Okay, so first off, just to introduce you to the Kalapuyans. We have all of these sort of like estimated areas in the valley where the Kalapuyans were, and this is my own map. And I create these basically so I don't have to pay somebody else for their map. So anyway, so here in this area, in the Eugene area, we have the Winfilly, the Chelamela, the Chafin or Chiffin people, and then we have Yoncallis to the south, and what I call the Paiute, or also called the Mohawk Valley people. So these are all different bands and different tribes that sometimes were interrelated and sometimes were aligned with each other as larger sort of tribes. But generally there are bands of people, usually a village or two, that were aligned together in this area. So we have upwards of, at some point, 19 throughout the valley. I don't have all the names on here, just some of them, because that would be a lot of names on the map. But anyway, so here's all the major ones. Like the Sandy Am are major. The Tualatin in the north is a pretty major tribe, things like that. So advance, please. All right, so one of the ethnographic resources I use is this calendar that Albert Gatchett gathered from the Grand Ronde Reservation in 1877 from Tualatin people. And so he talks about there being 12 months, and he talks about the different seasons. Their seasons here begin around September. Their year begins around September, at the end of the summer. And then they're sort of gathering, the Tualatin at least are gathering what they call Sagittaria, or the Wapato plant, which I'll show you pictures of in a minute. And then so, and that's a month or two of working with that plant, and they're gathering extra and processing it for the winter. And then right around now, they'd be working with camas. So right here, month 7, 8, 9, even to 10, upwards of so 4 months of the year they're working with camas, and that's a pretty significant percentage of the year. You know, a good third of the year is with camas processing, and they're actually digging camas twice, before it goes to flower and then after going to seed. So they're actually using camas in several periods, and then there are other Tualatin stories that I didn't throw on here that talk about them perhaps baking camas also in September, at the same time that they're gathering acorns in the same sort of pits or ovens, and that suggests that camas could be used perhaps all throughout the year, because we had so much in this valley. There was enough camas growing in the valley, and they help produce that camas by setting fire to the prairies and that. They didn't need agriculture. They had tons and tons of food through camas, wapato, acorns, and other root plants, and then hunting, and then fishing, and then everything was just a lot. So, advance, please. So I put together like a seasonal calendar, what we call a seasonal round for the tribe. They start out maybe doing hunting camps and some gathering camas early on. They may participate somehow in the spring Chinook run where they at least trade for it using their excess supplies. They may be gathering weaving materials like juncus and things in the valley for themselves to make baskets. Huckleberries, trade gatherings, more acorn camps in the summer, weaving materials, fall salmon, either a camp for they made weirs and traps, so it was not as prodigious and not as good as maybe having your own fishing falls, which they didn't really have around here. And so they would have to go for salmon really up to Willamette Falls and trade with the people there for the massive amounts of salmon they would have coming in for usually dried or smoked salmon. And then also setting fall prairie fires, usually between August to September, setting fires in the valley or even in the forest. And then maybe hazelnut camps and more hunting camps. And so much of the winter was spent inside of their longhouses and what we call winter villages, which are usually, according to our models, looked like they were up on a rise above the lower parts of the valley, so that they would not be sort of sitting in water, because the valley was apt to flood at any time of the year. So they generally were up on a rise somewhere. All right, advance. All right, so here's some of those plants. Wapato is a massive bulb, can be a massive bulb that is gathered from swamps and marshes and sort of wetland areas, lakes. And then we have camas over here, which is actually coming up right now. I bet you there's fields around here that have lots of camas in them if they haven't been disturbed in a while. So I know Crow Road's a good place to go see it. Outside of Eugene, I know there's areas outside of Springfield that have camas too. I have it all over Salem, so in my yard, because I've been planting it there. It's actually a pretty nice plant to plant in your yard as a flower, like a spring flower, because it actually, after about June, it basically disappears, and all the other sort of summer plants come in. You don't have to worry about that again until next spring again. Next. All right, so I'm an anthropologist, so I look at ethnography quite a bit. I look at the David Douglas notes, his journals, and he talks about, back in 1825, seeing Native people out on the prairies, burning the prairies, using that to sort of like, herd or influence deer into places where they could hunt them better, and then also gathering various foods from after the fires, wild wheat, and then roasted grasshoppers, things like that. And then storing that for the wintertime for winter use, because you're 3 to 4 months in the wintertime and very cold winters. You don't want to go outside in Oregon at that time. And then also digging camas at some place. And so these are all foods that they processed and would store for the wintertime, much like you would do winter storage today. Next. So the pattern for the Kalapuyans is really burning landscapes every year in the prairies, every 3 to 5 years in certain areas of the forest. I believe they did rotation of various areas, because once you've cleared out or spent a couple weeks in a camas field, much of the larger bulbs are cleared out. So you got to let that field sort of revive itself. It takes like 3 to 5 years to do that. So in the meantime, you go to another field, because there's plenty of fields in the valley, and you harvest there. And the same thing for acorns, the same thing for wapato, all these different plants. And so you do this rotation, about a 3 to 5 year rotation. That's what I call a cultural pattern. And then they rotate the harvest, like I said, then travel to and encamp for a week or two, and also process everything in the field. You're not taking everything back, all the raw product back to your home, processing it, leaving all the mess around your house. You're actually processing in the field and just leaving that, coming back to it next year, and everything's kind of cleaned up, because that's what happens in Oregon. And then preserving excess food, usually drying it out. Lots of stories talk about drying out animal flesh, fish, and plants. They process it, dry it out. Even acorns, which are normally talked about in most cultures as being sort of leached in water. They leach out the tannins, and then they would process them. Well, the Kalapuyans did the opposite direction. They would process them first, turn that into a flour, and then in the middle of the wintertime, they rehydrate them, and then in the process of rehydrating, they leach it out. And that's faster. It doesn't take several days or a week to leach out the tannins then. If it's just a flour, it leaches out very fast with a few, maybe bucket loads of water through that flour. So that's really good. So that they did an opposite pattern. And then accessing certain plants in starvation periods, because you don't have to chase them down. You know where they are. They're kind of in the ground, and you know where the fields are because you've been going back to that field every year for the rest of your life. So there you go. Next. All right. So some of the things that have helped us out, find out information about the past, is getting access to these journals for the Wilkes expedition. For those of you that may have some inkling of what that is, it was a huge U.S. exploring expedition that came down. It went first to the Pacific, mapped a lot of islands in the Pacific, and went up to British Columbia. In 1841, it came into the Columbia. One of their boats, the Peacock, wrecked offshore, and there's lots of images of that. And then the naval officers and their scientists that were on the expedition came, and they sort of divided up the party at Fort Vancouver. One half the party went north on the Columbia, and that was with Charles Wilkes. He went north, and the other party went south through the Willamette Valley all the way down to Sacramento. So this southern party, I've read the Wilkes journals for Oregon, and that's like books 4 and 5. And much of these details that we find in the journals for Emmons and Dana here, and then later on Eld, you'll see, don't appear in the Wilkes journals, the published journals. And so I don't know if Wilkes ever got access to these handwritten journals by these expedition scientists. I don't think so, because there's so much detail in them of this valley that makes sense that it just doesn't. I don't see him leaving it out if he had seen this stuff. Plus, we have these awesome hand-drawn maps of the valley that absolutely Wilkes would have included in the books if he had had access to them. So anyway, so this entry from Emmons on the top suggests that some characteristics of the fire. When they would burn the prairies, it would burn basically the grasslands in the center, and it would stop at the green patches of woods and narrow belts bordering streams. And so these, I think, were, because in the previous days of this, there had been rainstorms, and they had to stop their expedition going south. And so, that water would hang out in these sort of moisture sinks along the streams, and it would stop the fire. And so these fires were being set every year in the prairies to sort of like get rid of the excess undergrowth, to sort of promote the growth of the bulb plants that you use for food. And so I think that this really gives us a really good behavior pattern for this fire, what we call a cool burn fire that doesn't really destroy anything. And we see similar notes from Dana down here. Next. Okay. So, and this is also noticed by Jesse Applegate a decade later, or a few years later. He and his family come into Oregon around 1844. He writes about this in his books later on. He's kind of a historian in Oregon at the time. He saw it's custom of these Indians late in the autumn after the wild wheat was fairly ripe, and he's talking about tarweed to burn off the whole country. The grass would burn away and leave the pods well dried and bursting. Then the squaws, both young and old, would go with their baskets of bats and gather their grain. So he's talking about tarweed gathering, and he's talking about the cultural practice basically set by women in the tribe for gathering up the grains. And this is also the time where they're gathering sort of roasted grasshoppers and other stories and stuff too. So this kind of confirms almost exactly what the Wilkes folks are saying too. Next. So basically, the Kalapuyans are setting fire to the Valley Plains to promote growth of their bulbs, also to get rid of sort of pests. They also seemed to have this strategic way of setting fires, where they would set fires over here, they'd leave a few places open or green, and that would attract the deer and the elk to those green areas, so they knew where they were. They basically knew exactly where the deer would hang out. And then they go to the foothills for berries and harvest acorns in the valley. So different seasons, different things, just like showed on the season round. And I'm wondering, I have some questions about who is setting fires in the Cascades. We have other records of perhaps other tribes in the valley. In fact, around here, lots of records of Wasco and Klamath and Molalla people. Molalla were here already. They actually owned pretty much the whole east side of the valley. So we don't have a ton about their culture in terms of their culture harvesting in the valley. We have a few things. But what about their fire use? We wonder. So I have a project we're running in the Oak Ridge area, trying to figure out what is the use of fire in the woods. You know, up in the Oak Ridge area, where there's some odd landscapes of oak and ponderosa pine in the same place. Next. So, following a little bit of the pattern for the Klamath, back in the 1960s, Ted Stern wrote a book about the Klamath. He doesn't really talk about much about at all, or mention at all, that they would come into the Willamette Valley and hang out with their friends and relatives, the Molalla people, camp with them all summer long, and in the meantime they were hunting elk. Doesn't talk about that. We have lots and lots of accounts in our newspapers from the time period, lots of accounts that go back into the 1850s. That's when our newspapers really begin here, about the Klamath in the valley. They actually were part of a couple what we call wars in the valley, the Battle Creek incident at Salem and the Abaquah battle outside of Molalla. And there was actually an incident down here near Pleasant Hill where Elijah Bristow was kind of not very nice with them and shot one of them and killed one of them, and they decided not to come back for 20 years because he was very angry with them and very aggressive. But our highways today are really based upon native trails. The original, what we call territorial highways, are based on native trails. So we see all these highway corridors. That's where the tribes were coming into the valley from the Klamath area. So we see Klamath Falls in the south. They would travel up through these mountain trails and then end up coming past Oak Ridge into Eugene area on those trails. And there's actually a place there called the Klamath Trail that pretty much follows the same path of the highway. The highway's on a different footprint, but it's pretty much the same thing. Same thing with other trails that go into the Salem area. One of those trails, called the Klamath Trail, goes right down the North Santiam corridor, right into Salem, directly into Salem, and actually follows the same footprint as State Street in Salem. So that is an original native trail. And then we had the last trail one of the trails goes to Oregon City because they would do a lot of trading in Oregon City. Another trail goes all the way to the Dalles, where they would do a lot of trading up at Dalles too. So, all right, next. So this is that environment. I've been up there a number of times now. We've been studying it for a couple of years. It's an odd environment up near Oak Ridge of there being lots of oaks in like this oak savanna type environment, and ponderosa pines in the same place. They're being encroached upon by cedars and firs and pines and stuff because the wisdom of the U.S. government has been to sort of stop all fires. But in the patterns in the past, we think was enforced by setting fires on sort of an annual or semi-annual basis up there, and then basically stressing out the firs and pines and cedars and leaving the oaks and ponderosas behind. And both these trees, the ponderosas and the oaks, are food plants. Next. So this is a process that we were privileged to experience this a couple of weeks ago, where Perry Choctoot from the Klamath tribe came and visited with us up there, and went to a ponderosa, and we pulled off some of this intercambrium bark from the ponderosa, and that is in the spring the bark runs with a lot of sap, and it's supposedly really sweet. And I tried it out, and I didn't really get it, but I believe what he says. So apparently that was a food plant that they would go to find and it's not just a starvation food, it's actually a regular encampment they would make up in the woods to harvest intercambrium bark. And I think that that some of the bands of the Klamath, not the whole tribe, that would come into the Willamette Valley, hang out with their relatives, the Molalla, and they were interrelated with them, would, in the process of coming over the Cascades, would stop, harvest some Cambrian bark in the spring, and then later on in the fall, take off back home with all the elk that they've been sort of drying up and smoking up, and then harvest perhaps huckleberries and then acorns from the oak groves and stuff. So that becomes a very long, we call it seasonal round for that tribe. Next. So there's your huckleberries. Next. Okay, so I put together a little sort of like seasonal round of for the few bands that came into the valley, and they would be, you know, upwards of 100 people, 200 people sometimes in the valley on horses. And so horses clearly made all this stuff really possible. You'd be able to take a lot of product with you back home, back to Klamath Falls from your trip into the valley for the whole season. Next. All right, so let me move on out of fire and other tribes to something I'm really excited about, looking at Willamette Valley wetlands and what it was like before. Next. Okay, so today, pretty much most of our valley is ag fields. If it's not a city or a road, it's an agricultural field. Only 1% of the whole valley is any kind of traditional landscape, and that's just a few parks. Next. Back in the 1930s, this is what our land would do when it rained. We would see the swaling and ponding action. This is at the North San Am. That's a normal pattern for the valley, and farmers would be kind of upset because if that happened in the summertime, which was apt to do back then, because when I was a kid, 1970s and 80s, I always thought that, you know, it could rain any day. Nowadays it's a little warmer. It doesn't necessarily rain every day, but back then. And so normally that's what happens to our land. And this was somewhat changed by the Willamette Valley Project, where they brought millions of dollars from the federal government to build the 17 dams that ring now the valley. And a portion of that money went into ditching and I think drain tiling for farmers, where they were able to put drain tiles into the land and sort of drain it out all the time. And I'll show you kind of what that means. About that in a minute. Next. So I initially got started on this looking at Lake LaBiche outside of Salem, north of Salem. This is a old lake bed, and the lake is the blue part here. Then we have the yellow part, which is all the swaling that comes off of it in the wet season. And so what I figured out by doing a bunch of research over a few days, looking through newspaper accounts, is that these farmers, and you see these farmer plots in 1850s here, and there must have been many more by the 1890s, but they were kind of upset they couldn't use all of their land for agriculture. They could only use like 20% of it, and the rest of it was all wetland. It was called worthless land because it was a seasonal wetland. All their fields here are called, you know, it's like the best graded soil, #1 soils in the valley. So what they did to drain it off is they attracted land speculators from California to come up. The Hayes brothers, which are the inheritors of the San Jose Mercury News fortune, and they bought 1,000 acres inside the lake bed, what's called worthless land, at $1 an acre. Okay, that's $1,000. They're a huge investment, right? So they spent also $150,000 of their own money to build a trench, a ditch, all the way to the Willamette River, 6 miles to the west. By 1918, they declared the lake drained. They were draining off the water at a fast enough rate that they could have like crops all summer long and not worry so much about it flooding out. Of course, that took some more decades to actually be realized because they had to put another dam in. They put in pumping station by the 1960s. It's pretty much drained 24/7. Water's always being drained out. And in the midst of putting in the ditching, they also put in drain tiling under the soil so that it's constantly draining off. And I'll show you what that means. Next. So if you don't know, drain tiling is these now plastic pipes that are put underground about a foot or so, probably about 2 feet underground, and they are constantly draining out the land so that that ponding action on the top never happens anymore. The water drains down and it gets pushed out through these pipes into local ditches and rivers, and then it goes away. So then the farmers can actually control exactly how much moisture is on their land. So their soil ends up being super, super arid, and it's really good for agriculture. It's peat soil, so it's really great in this lake bed. I believe what the Hayes brothers did is they made pretty good money on that land, that investment. After the land was drained off, it was now rated #1 agricultural peat soil, which is a super nutritious black soil, some of the best ag land in the world. And they would turn around and sold much of it at a huge profit. One of the brothers bought a huge subdivision in northeast Salem called Hayesville, and the other brother took his winnings and went up north. And next, and let me show some pictures of before we go north. So here is Lake LaBiche today. It's pretty much onion fields, hazelnuts, and blueberries, and the soil, if you could see it better, is actually black. It's super nutritious. They're only using the top 6 inches or so for agricultural part. It never runs out of nutrients. They never have to let it go fallow because there's so much nutrients there. It just constantly produces. Next. Other way. Other way. All right. So a farmer, I wrote that article, I put it on my blog site. I called it Draining Lake LaBiche. You can look it up right now if you want. But a farmer 6 months later contacted me. He has 70-something acres in Lake LaBiche, and he said 20 years ago he put it into conservation, got some federal and Ducks Unlimited type money to make a waterfowl area here, and he started managing it as a natural landscape. And then this Wapato began coming back, and he had back then a couple years ago he had 4 plots of Wapato come back by itself. He didn't plant it. So there's something of a seed bank there, we think, that allowed it to come back once you stop disking and plowing it up and stuff. And next. So last year I went there, and there had been something of a lake form because there was a lot of moisture last winter. And then we see ducks in the water here. We see the water sticking around for longer because he's been destroying the drain fields. And I think that water pushed all of the Wapato seeds around, so that last summer I went back there, and there was literally Wapato everywhere. It wasn't in these scattered patches. They were actually everywhere. So I think in a few years, it's just going to be one vast Wapato field. Next. That's your Wapato. It's kind of young. It's going to take a couple years to get bigger. If you try to dig it too soon in the midsummer, the bulbs are non-existent. They're very small. If you wait till the end of September, they end up being bigger and more nutritious. Next. Okay, so the other brother went up to Wapato Lake outside of Gaston, south of Hillsboro, and he did the same thing, bought 800 acres of land inside the lake bed. He and a couple farmers built ditches to the north, went to the Tualatin River, and by 1935, he had the whole thing drained out. And this is a giant complex, much larger than Lake LaBiche. It had this whole huge drain field that went off to the south. It must have been an amazing amount of Wapato because it was called Wapato Lake, but it must have looked like something like this. This is not an actual picture. And it turns out that we have much more ethnographic information about this lake than we did Lake LaBiche. The Tualatins wanted it as their reservation in 1851. They never got it because that treaty was never ratified. But you see their boundary, they want right around Wapato Lake. I also found out by doing newspaper research, because there's not a lot of history about this lake, that the farmers there, again, were upset, but they were in approval of draining off all the water. But one of the things they were upset about was there was like tens of thousands of ducks that came and then ate the Wapato and the little critters that were in the water too. And so these, what we call canvasback ducks, would hang out in the lake in like giant flocks of ducks and geese. And then, so sportsmen got wind of this. They started coming down there from Portland with their shotguns and shooting ducks in the lake every weekend, to the point where they just stopped collecting the ducks and they just left them dying in the lake. And the only reason the farmers were upset is because they smelled bad. So, but by 1935, the lake was gone, the ducks are gone, the Wapto was gone, everything was gone. It was turned into a giant sort of agricultural landscape. The problem with that valley, it does produce a lot of water because it's pretty closely ringed with hills. So by the 1980s, the farmers kind of gave up. They began selling the land back to the federal government to remake the lake. And so now, as of a year ago, this lake was reopened as a National Wildlife Refuge. And they put a trail in, they sort of officially opened it. We're still working on, like through the Grand Ronde Tribe, we're still working on planting Wapto back in the lake. Some Wapto is starting to come back in a slow manner. I figure about 10 years to revive the lake. The water's starting to come back. They have to destroy the drain fields again, but we're starting to see the return of that. And so we have high hopes it's going to return as Wapto Lake. So next. So then after these sort of lake expeditions, so to speak, I was wondering, so how much of this land we live in was actually wetland? Next. Well, back to the Wilkes expedition, they actually have not just information about fire, but information about these giant wetlands that existed in the valley in 1841. They call it Lake La Malie, 80 feet in width, 3/4 of a mile in length, and about a foot deep the same day, you notice, these two journals. So that's a huge, pond that was not very deep, so it probably didn't stick around very long, probably drained off in a few days. That's interesting. Let's see how much more we have next. So going into the GLO maps, the General Land Office maps from the 1850s, the first survey maps taken by Oregon surveyors, we see this map of the wet Camas Prairie outside of Rickreall, giant Camas Prairie. Next. This is the central Willamette Valley from Salem up. We see Hayesville down here again. Lake LaBiche. I said Poison. I think it's actually Poisson Lake there at Mount Angel. And then we have the Miry Swamper Slough up by Woodburn. And then we have over in the Tualatin Valley, we have these two areas coming out of the Coast Range that were called swamps. And one is still there, the Killen Wetlands is still there. The rest of it is this giant ag land area down by Kansas City that I'll bet you has been all ditched and drain tiled. Next. So we have, again, another map from just south of Corvallis. It's called Marysville at the top there. That's the original name for Corvallis. All these areas were blue on the map, if you could see it. So I shaded in for you over here on the side. That's all wet prairie. So I'm guessing that means wet Camas Prairie, because that surveyor didn't know what Camas was, or he did it in the wrong season, didn't see Camas. Maybe if he did it in later summer or fall or whatever, he wouldn't see the Camas. But that's a wet prairie, a wet Camas Prairie. And we know that Camas grows really good south of Corvallis. Next. And then south of Eugene here, there was an area called Camas Swale, which is pretty much an airport and a bunch of ag fields today outside of Cresswell. And so there's actually still a sign on the highway called Camas Swale Creek. I was going to put that in here, but I haven't. I took a picture of that a couple days ago. I didn't put it on here. But anyway, this giant place, and we have ethnography from Lane County Archives suggesting by Lillian Henry that the native people were gathering Camas in that swale. So all this research suggests that wetlands is a bigger deal in the valley than we know. That first picture we saw of the sort of dry, arid landscape of the valley from Peterson Butte is just not the way it originally was. Next. I think that our water was much more dominant, that we had a regular pattern of seasonal wetland action here because there was lots of water, lots of rainfall all year round. Winter, spring, summer, and fall, which is odd. I think it's a pattern basically produced by the Cascade Range, really. And I think that the Kalapuyans, ethnographically, culturally, were adapted to that environment. And I know a lot of the descriptions of Kalapuyans don't talk about their wetland environments, It talks about them gathering sort of camas from the prairies, things like that. I think it was wet prairies. We have to throw the word wet in there or water in there all the time. I think the Kalapuyan mounds were set up to be seasonal encampment sites above the water level so that you don't wake up in water in the morning, because the mounds, as you probably know, were 10 to 15 feet tall only. So they're only there to basically be above that seasonal flooding. I think Indian trails that became territorial highways were not situated down the center of the valley where the lowest parts of the valley are, but on the sides where the foothills are. So you're not walking through water, you're walking through pretty much a dry or fairly dry landscape. And most of our village sites that I'm finding evidence of are suggesting they're on higher ground than down by the river. And all the notes about like river encampments and things, river villages, I think those were summer villages where people would move down to the river in the summertime, set up these shanties, they call brush houses by the river, and then it didn't matter if they flooded because they're just a brush house, so you just let it flood out. But all your valuable stuff, all your food and stuff is stored up at your winter village, which is about a mile or half mile to a mile upland somewhere above the water. And I think that our plants and animals were very much adapted to this wetland environment, and so I'm looking for more evidence of more things in the valley that were adaptations to a regular seasonal wet environment rather than our assumption that there was a dry environment all the time. Next. So in the debate about fire, I know that you've probably been a part of that. I know it's a big deal in Eugene. A lot of folks are looking at fire as kind of the answer to some of our problems. We need to try to revive our environment with fire and bring it back in a healthy way. But I think we also need to throw water into the picture. And I think that a lot of the descriptions of setting fires in the valley from 1841 was right after or right during there being rainstorms and wetland action. So the water may have actually been a mitigating influence on the fire itself, slowing it down, cooling it off clearly, and not burning deeply into the land. But then I just think that we need to have both in our thoughts when we are doing any kind of restoration activity. If you're restoring an oak savanna, you're restoring a camas field, if you want to restore some land, you got to let water come back to the land because that's the original pattern here. And right now we've kind of made an enemy of a lot of water. For the longest time in the 20th century, people didn't want it sitting around because they thought it was where pestilence came from, or it was a useless land, or it was wasted land. And so we need to allow water to come back for, things like groundwater to come back, because that's a really important part of the environmental health. I think it's actually important for like fish health too. If people are really concerned about salmon in our rivers, we have one of the healthiest salmon runs, if not the only healthy salmon run on the whole Columbia River network. And so salmon don't actually spawn in the mainstream. Take out those dams, that's great, but they don't spawn in the mainstream. They spawn in these upper areas, and we need to make sure their spawning grounds are healthy, they have enough nutrients in them. So if we allow the water to remain as groundwater, I think it's going to pick up more nutrients as it comes out to the rivers and streams and creeks. So that's just my own thoughts. I'm not a biologist, so I'm assuming biologists will say, yeah, that makes sense. But anyway, so that's my thought. We need to throw water into the picture too, because both those things were kind of made illegal in Oregon, and now we need to bring them back and sort of manage them in the right way so that we can bring back our land. There are reports that I've read from the United Nations that have suggested that if we want to preserve the natural wildlife in our world, we need to allow 1/3 of our land to be native and wild. And right now in this valley, we're at 1%. So we have a ways to go. I think there's options. Clearly, some areas upstream could be restored. Maybe streams like the Lucky Mute River would be a good place to sort of do a lot of restoration on, because there's not a lot of water management up there on Lucky Mute. So that would bring back a large percentage of the valley, but we need to do something if we want to preserve our wildlife because much has been destroyed. Next. Goodbye. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
Ruth is going to gather some questions. Ooh, uh-oh. All I can say is, wow, that's just amazing research. Another hand. That is just incredible. So you've touched on this, but how are fire methods used by the Kalapuya informing us today? You've discussed it, but where do you see that evolving? And we're also a beaver state. Can you speak to water and beaver? Does that fall into your research at all?
Yeah, so people have asked me about, bringing back beavers as a way to sort of restore the environment. I think that is maybe a secondary step. I think that the problem is we don't want farmers and people don't want to have, right now, they don't want the opinion is against having sort of standing marshland, standing swampland and stuff. The assumption is it takes away from our ag land, because ag is always the biggest thing in the area. And then, and so I think we need to have some sort of movement towards allowing water to return, to allow water to stand, to allow things like marshes and swamps to remain. Because, maybe there's more mosquitoes in the valley, maybe that's annoying, but still that's healthier for the environment than not. And then once we allow water to remain, then bringing beavers back to create that ponding action, those really basically what we call wealthy areas, those areas with lots of different wildlife growing, diversity of wildlife growing, would be good. In terms of fire, I mean, we're pretty much following the Kalapuya pattern. We're doing a lot of experiments, understanding how fire works in this valley. I don't assume at least, that the fire up here acts the same with our white oak as it does in California with the tan oak. So we're doing experiments with that to see how our tan oak reacts, how things like weevils react, things like that. So we're doing some experiments to sort of bring that back. Yeah.
When did the people in the valley get horses? You mentioned horses being significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think anthropologically, the assumption is around 1700. Horses came back. They were being traded up from the south, through the Paiute peoples into the north, and we see that like Nez Perce and Shoshone people were getting horses, and were modifying the breeds, and they made their own sort of like Appaloosa type horses back then. And there's been some question about how much there were horses in this valley. We know that the Klamath had lots of horses, used them on their travels. We know that the Klickitats did the same thing. Klickitat would mount up. There's records of them coming across the Columbia with groups of like 700 to 800 people, all mounted on horseback. And they were annoying to the settlers because they couldn't do anything about them because there were too many people. But and then the Kalapuyans themselves, people thought, well, they didn't have many horses; they were not rich people. But I found these invoices from the 1855 treaty negotiations at Dayton with Joel Palmer, and he was very good at writing out all of his invoices and everything that happened, how many meals he gave everybody, how much horse feed, and they had upwards of 800 horses at these gatherings because the horse feed count was huge. So they did have a significant number of horses. Yeah.
What does Wapato taste like, and what does it get used for?
Well, it's used for food, and it's mildly like a potato flavor. I think the early settlers called it Indian potato, and so they liked it. It was a replacement for potato in a sense, but Native people liked it a lot too, and they would roast it up over in a slow fire kind of situation, and they would eat it pretty well. I mean, it was pretty well liked in the area. Yeah.
Are drain tiles being removed, and how difficult is that to do a field system?
So I've seen a few experiments for removal of drain tiles. Removing them is very costly because they're underneath, they're about 18 inches apart, 2 feet down, all the way across your land. So that's a lot of piping. So what they've figured out is if they take a trencher through that and trench through that in these lines, then they can actually destroy the effect of the drain tiling, and the water sticks around. So I've seen some experiments like that, and they tend to work. So, yeah. But it's still being done. It's still actually a active practice that's being proposed and actually used in agriculture today. So.
What's the relationship between the rainforest and the wetlands in Pacific Northwest?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
They're two different things, right?
I think the Olympic Peninsula is a little more rainforesty. Maybe in the wintertime we have more of a rainforest here, but I don't know. It's all a matter of, I think it's a matter of how much rainfall you have. And we have a lot here, so certain years will probably have more. Yeah.
What do you think of the Klamath restoration projects, getting rid of dams?
I think it's a good step forward. I mean, the dams, the electricity produced by those dams is much being replaced by solar and other means. So there's really no use for them unless people want to just continue to sort of entertain themselves with boating and stuff like that. But and they had seriously destroyed this whole resource, this whole environment for all the fish and stuff, for all the salmon. And the tribes, legally deserved and to have their salmon and their salmon resources, and that's better for the environment. The whole area is not as sort of well settled as other areas of California, so so I think it really is a good project. Yeah.
So this is a similar question in terms of what you talk about more water. How do the dams and reservoirs in the Willamette Valley fit into this picture?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to tackle the whole federal government and the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, the tribes have been working on getting the dams removed in the Columbia for 40, 50 years now, and they haven't made much headway on the Columbia River, at least. I mean, I think we do have blueprints in the Klamath for what could happen in the Columbia. The problem is, I think the biggest problem, though, is California. I mean, the original reason for all the dams was to feed the appetite of Californians for power, because they don't have the water resources, they don't have the power resources that we have up here. So all of our power doesn't stick around here, it gets sent down south. So unless California gets busy and starts putting in a little more power generation, like wind generation and solar or whatever they're doing, we're not gonna take out the dams here.
What would be the incentive for someone to remove drain pipes?
Well, I guess if you're a farmer, there's really no incentive, but and I'm not going to take on the whole ag sector of Oregon. That's pretty big. But for this one farmer up at Lake the Bish, he basically was tired of being an onion farmer. He'd been several generations onion farming in his family, and he wasn't making a ton of money. I mean, the amount you make on farming is not that great unless you have tons of land. So he was able to replace his income with this conservation income from the federal government, from grants and things like that. And he's done very well with that. So if you get tired of farming, I think a lot of farmers don't see the next generation following them nowadays. People are saying, kids are like, I don't want to be a farmer, I'm going to go to the city or whatever. So I think if you want to keep that, you want to do something to restore that land, you're not making any money on your land, I think that if ever grants are available again in the federal government, we could perhaps do more conservation work. Yeah.
Have you heard that the native peoples in the region called the Willamette Valley the Valley of Death because of the allergic effect of pollen captured in the valley? How do you think air quality affected with these burns? Was that an issue at the time?
Yeah, I don't think that was an issue. For burns themselves, the smoke from what we call a cool burn, which is a burn that happens every year to 3 years is not as deeply a burn as we see in catastrophic fires, where you have actually wood ash in the burn itself. So there's been smoke studies for like wildfire as opposed to regular burning, and the smoke produced in a regular cool burn is not as much, it's not as bad. In terms of the sort of Valley of Death, this is an Americanization of perhaps the meaning of the Willamette. The original word, Willamette, was a village outside of Clackamas that was called Willamette, and that's the original origin of the word Willamette. So it didn't have any kind of meaning close to Valley of Death. That again, that's kind of a settler Americanization of those kind of words.
I'm going to get over here. My back is, so obviously we're looking at you to fix everything. So.
And I'm doing it.
And you're doing it. One camas bulb at a time, right? How can people accommodate restoration? Do we change where we live, how and where we build?
I think that could be part of the answer. I mean, building your dream house in the middle of the forest is probably not the best idea in the world. It's huge, a huge insurance problem. It's dangerous right now. With the current forest policies, national forest policies, they've been putting out fires for a long time, and so that builds up the amount of fuel is in the forest. And when the right conditions happen, like in 2020, you end up with like massive forest fires that nearly destroy everything. So yeah, I think it's a problem building into the forest. It's maybe a beautiful place, but but don't live there. I mean, seriously, it's not a very safe place to live unless you expect to be burned down. And so, and then there are ways, like there's a film called Elemental. If you've seen that, maybe you guys could show that sometime. It's a pretty interesting film, and it's called Elemental. It was produced a couple years ago. It actually shows how you can armor your house against fire by not having drain piping and stuff, not allowing any place where leaves can collect, by putting a metal roof on, by pushing the vegetation back from your house, quite a ways. So there are ways of preserving your house for fire situations. It may not be the perfect dream home, lodge that you wanted from your childhood, but it may be something you could survive a fire. Yeah, I think that is an issue, sure.
Thank you for your teaching at OSU and teaching the public like us. What are your students' greatest areas of interest in your research and teaching?
Well, I think they're interested in a lot of these things. I think a lot of are drawn by, my blog site has been really influential in the Valley. People are now growing up with it, and then they learn that I exist. So they actually contact me and try to take classes for me and stuff, and you get my book and things like that. I think the one comment I get every term from students that take my class for the first time is, they are kind of at times upset that they didn't hear about all this information about Native people before they got to college, and so they're upset at their high school and their whole public school system that's not offering this curriculum in school, and they're realizing at that point, and many of them have said this to me, that they have to relearn everything. So that suggests that our public schools are not really doing their job, that our histories are not well written, that even though the state of Oregon has had several projects to have curriculum put into schools that talk about Native American history and culture, that none of that's actually being yet taught in the schools at all. And we are a decade and a half into that project. So when is it going to be taught? And I raised this issue back in the day, like 10 years ago, when we first got money under SB 13 to get Native American curriculum written for the schools, and it's all written. It's on the website. They have a whole Native American education website on the state education site, and you can download the curriculum now if you want to look at it. I said there's not a lot of money in this given by the state to actually make it happen, and there isn't a good plan for training your teachers how to train the curriculum. And right now, those teachers don't that go through colleges like OSU. They have an education college there. There's nothing in their education degree that suggests they should take an ethnic studies course or a native studies course so they can feel comfortable teaching a native studies or ethnic studies curriculum. So I'm not sure what they're going to do. I think that all the education schools need to sort of modify their policies to fit what Oregon wants, because Oregon has suggested a number of things. Like the legislature has said, teach Native American education, teach Latinos, teach Black, teach Jewish, teach outdoor school. I mean, all this stuff is unfunded mandates, really, but they're saying this is an important thing, and I think that our education systems need to get on board, and I think that all of the school districts and boards need to also get on board with that and push that through their districts. It's the school boards that really, at times, can control the policies, and the school supervisors need to sort of get on board with that too, and then make time and money available for teachers to actually go through their continued education credits to learn how to teach these curriculum so they can feel comfortable in the classroom teaching it. It's a big problem that they've never really dealt with yet. The state of Oregon hasn't dealt with it. Districts have pretty much not dealt with it. And so I'm seeing scattered areas being taught, like in Hillsborough, in Washington County, maybe a few schools in Portland, but that's about it. So.
I want to thank you for that, because and I want to thank somebody for the question, because one of the things the League of Women Voters has really kind of struggled with is that we used to start every meeting with a land acknowledgement. And what we've talked about is we want that to be meaningful. We don't want it just to be words, which is what we hear is needed. So if you give us something we can do, and because we have lots of educators, former teachers, and even a former board member in the room, tell us what we can do to be an ally to help you with this effort.
Well, I think that answering my concerns is a big part. I mean, part of the problem is legislature mandates this stuff, and these legislatures get this, tick mark on their resume saying, "I did this thing," but the thing is not funded by anybody. We have a weak education system in Oregon, so the state of Oregon can't tell districts what to do. They can just suggest it's a good idea. So, so all the things I've said, if we can somehow get more time and training for teachers, and I think that would be helpful. People showing up at the school board meetings and say, "What are you doing about Native American education? What are you doing about Black education? What are you doing about these various ethnic studies type educations that have been mandated by the legislature? What are we going to do about that?" And they're probably going to say, "Well, we don't have any money for that, so we can't do it." And so then maybe it's time to go look for some money for that. If money exists in the federal system, I don't know.
Yeah, or the Oregon system at this point. One of the things you mentioned was your blog site as a resource for us to go to read more. Are there other newsletters or suggestions for us to stay informed about what is important to local tribes?
Yeah, my blog site is pretty extensive. It's over 500 essays, and I haven't really added a ton to it the last few years because I've been working on more publications like the book and stuff. But it stands for what it is. I looked pretty deeply at a lot of different issues about what was happening during the time when people were being colonized, placed on reservations, what happened during the treaties, and in the process of doing that research, I found a lot of things that nobody had seen before. So that was pretty good. So that's one resource. There are each of the tribes pretty much has one or two scholars that are doing good work. Patricia Phillips from the Coos has got an ethnobotany book, which is pretty good. George Aguilar from Warm Springs has his book When the River Ran Wild, which is pretty good. Umatilla has a couple books. Cowlitz has a couple books from Michelle Jacobs. So there's lots of books out there you can read. If we can somehow, have a reading club. Do you have a reading club? Well, there you go. That, some of these other books are good too. I would suggest George Aguilar and Patricia Phillips and those folks are some of the best, yeah.
I'm hoping somebody took notes so that we have those names for us. Yes. Our next book group, we've actually been reading about democracy and have been doing several series on democracy, but I think we're ready for a new read. And to close, this is the last question. On this Earth Day, what is your message to us?
I don't know if I have an Earth Day message. I don't know. That's a big stress. I don't know why. I think that the way I've learned to think about it from my elders and people in the tribe is that, the earth is not just a resource to be extracted from and to be destroyed in our search for wealth, but it's actually a relative. And all of the animals and plants and rocks and trees and mountains and waters and everything else we're all related to those things. And so we have a relationship with them. They are like brothers and sisters, and if you rather say aunts and uncles, that's better. I mean, you don't like your brothers and sisters, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying, they're relatives. And so whatever you do to your relatives, you do to you do to your family. So just be thinking about that in the future, that treat the earth like your relative, or maybe your better relatives, and then I think we'll have a better future.
Woo-hoo. Well done, well said. Thank you, everybody. I have a couple of just really short announcements. Ruth is in the back, ready to help anybody with membership details in terms of the whole online portal, which is changing. We'll have articles continuing in the newsletter to help you kind of navigate that new system. We have books for sale, and so a reminder that this is Kalapuya land. And I want to thank you all for coming, and again, thank our guest one more time. Thank you so much.